Okay, well, I appreciate the invite on getting the chance to be here. And so, in fact, I think I have as exciting a topic as there is, but I'm a little bit biased. But I think as we talk about and kind of think about it personally, of course, I grew up in the 4-H and FFA uh, programs and organizations, and did show sheep as well at in South Dakota was home. My family has Cordell sheep, and then also raised and showed some club lambs as well. And so, what I really enjoyed in my personal world was being able to identify those lambs that are of a little bit more value, and to understand if and why that happens within our industry. And I'm certainly excited to share with you kind of a little bit on some lamb carcass data, and then also how it can be applied within your operations and within your programs as well. So the first thing that I want to do again is I actually am part of a great group of people at North Dakota State University and also the University of Minnesota, and share an extension commitment and appointment through both of those universities, and have outreach in North Dakota and Minnesota, and again of getting the chance to look at different carcasses that were in a research project. And my graduate student Laura continues to help me with my projects and with the research that we've got going on. And so, if you're ever interested in as you move forward and graduate at the high school level, and you're interested in come seeing us, well, we'd certainly be happy to have you here as we continue to work on a sheep-focused program at North Dakota State University. So a couple things before we dig in and look at carcass merit in generalities is that I wanted to touch just a little bit based on breeds and composition of breeds. And so, again, we have differences on wool breeds, of particularly up at the top left with our Rambouillet up here, okay? And also we have Columbias, and we have our Cordells down in the bottom right. And then, in fact, this is a Dorset pair right here in the bottom, but there's still some wool value. They can be, again, more dual purpose relative to the amount of wool and meat. Certainly, we do have some there with some wool that we can be able to look at. Now, relative to that data, we're not going to expect those to have as muscular or as fast a growing progeny as the meat breeds that we potentially have available for us to utilize and to offer. And so, from the top left, we've got a Hampshire sheep. We move over to a Suffolk on our top right. The bottom left is a Shropshire. And then, again, we've got a Dorset there in the bottom right. So I think that most importantly, as we look at the data and the information that is available to us, is that we can expect these to have different amount of emphasis on how you're selecting those. And so, again, you'll have other presenters that talk more about maternal use and impact on how you can help in terms of replacement females or different other options that we have in our industry. But again, I'm going to touch more so on the meat breeds and the carcass merit that we do have. There's also a shift in a portion of our industry that says, you know what, I don't want to shear my sheep anymore. And in fact, consequently, we have an increase in the amount of hair breeds in America. And so those of the Dorper on the top, in fact, going across on the top right or white Dorper, and then in the bottom are either Katahdins or even Royal White or St. Croix influenced type sheep. And so differences relative to those hair breeds, but they are becoming more popular within our industry. And in fact, the Katahdins, relative to information and the National Sheep Improvement Program, one of the groups that's doing a really good job of collecting a lot of information, a lot of data to move their industry forward. One of the things that I think is important as we think about carcass merit is that we have to realize that we can be able to look at differences on average daily gain or the expected growth rate for differences in how those lambs are on the frame size and the amount of growth that you would expect from them. So those that are larger framed or taller and longer, you're going to take those out to a higher live weight and continue to increase that daily gain at a higher level for a longer period of time. And of course, the bigger difference there is when you have the end product of how much extra fat or extra adipose tissue that you're going to get on some of those lambs. And so that's an important thing to keep into consideration. So in generalities, if you have a south down weather, you're going to take that one to potentially 115 to 120. If you had something that was more Hampshire or more Suffolk or potentially larger framed, ones that you could still take to 130, 140, maybe even 150 pounds of live weight before you become a challenge with those individuals of the market weathers or market ewes that you're showing. Now, this is a big important one in my personal opinion because we use a quarter there on that picture to identify the scale of our product. And this is where things become more challenging for our industry because we have big challenges relative to product uniformity. As we continue and hopefully in the progress of my tenure here at North Dakota State University is that we're going to identify a time when lambs that are trimmer and more muscular hopefully will provide a greater amount of premium and reward for those producers so that we can be able to meet those consumer expectations and provide a high quality product. Now that you can make a decision on your own of which is right, of if it's more larger or smaller or somewhere in between, but in fact, those top loin chops that we see there, those are actually ones that have approximately a 3.0 to 3.2 square inch ribeye or loin eye area in this particular evaluation. And the ones that are at the bottom, and these were in Wisconsin, and the ones that were at the bottom were actually from a Whole Foods in Florida. Those came from a Katahdin-focused group, and in which case that one was just a little bit over 1.5 square inches of ribeye or loin eye area. I'm convinced that's smaller than we need, and in fact, I think that we can make progress, but we don't particularly know progress unless we can identify what we're trying to do and what we're trying to move forward with. I got to show you the aberration or the wild and crazy outlier that I've been a part of, and that's the sheep here on the top left. As you can tell, he's got a spot on his hip, on his right hip, and in fact, that was his name. His name was Spot. Here's one that set the standard in terms of dressing percentage. This is one that had a dressing percentage of over 60%, and in fact, closer to 65%, which is way on the edge. And in fact, some may say that that one's too trim at approximately 2/10 of back fat at the 12th rib, and I'll show you where we would evaluate that as well. But also, here's one that scanned with 6.2 square inches of loin eye. If you recall from the previous slide of where the top row is on the high end, a moderate end, and the bottom one is on the low end, here's that same similar size quarter with those lovely lamb chops that had to sacrifice themselves for the sake of science. They were great. Certainly they were big, and you can see that those two chops on their own fill up a frying pan as well. And so if we know that that's something that we can do, that provides a bonus. As a point of information, though, I'll let you know that Spot was in the county fair and in fact was at a Minnesota county fair. He went fourth, and in fact, the judge said maybe if it was more about carcass merit, here's the one that you would want. Now, he's kind of rounder in his hip, and you guys that are evaluators know that he's a little bit bigger in his shoulder, and you can even see that in the carcass, but there's some true emphasis, and don't or keep into consideration that as we talk about it from the show ring standpoint or your 4-H and FFA projects, that these are all going into the commercial setting as well. And so this is important to keep that in mind, that we can be able to think with the end in mind and try to move forward on what we're trying to accomplish. One of the things that I'll tell you is that in the state of North Dakota, we have a lamb ultrasound carcass value contest. And so with this, we collect data at the 12th and 13th or between the 12th and 13th rib to identify those on market lambs at the North Dakota State Fair that are doing better than their contemporaries. And so if we can provide those that are producing and doing a really high quality product and doing it with some trimness and some muscularity, we think that that holds value, and those people should be rewarded for producing those more preferred and higher quality and higher cutability carcasses. Here's my colleague, Dr. Chris Schauer, and in fact, a fellow graduate student that we work with, Amanda Long, there as well, collecting the data. I apologize, you'll have to be a little bit creative as the lamb's head is coming off the left side of the screen, and so we put that transducer or that probe there over approximately about the middle of the back. Those of you that have handled lambs, as you know, you go down the top line and you handle where that last rib is to the front of its hip. That, of course, is its loin. The loin, in generalities, also has one rib. And so when we harvest those carcasses or fabricate those carcasses, 4 ribs stay in the front shoulder, 8 stay in the rack, and then 1 stays in the loin in terms of merchandising. And so when we are aiming to collect that information, we are trying to evaluate the amount of 12th rib back fat, the body wall area, and then also the ribeye area at the 12th rib. In fact, when we're collecting some ultrasound information, that provides us with a tool. I will tell you that, again, we've got several different tools that we can be able to evaluate. Now, the exciting thing about using the ultrasound image is that they obviously don't have to be harvested. In fact, that's why we would want to use that as an information gatherer for us to collect that data. Because those can be used primarily on seed stock rams or seed stock ewes, and then be able to make selection decisions from that. An important part of that, if you were using that ultrasound, as previously shown on that last slide, is that you want to make sure that you get a quality image. In fact, here is a picture of a beef ribeye, and the indentation that we have up here at the top is also what's considered that acorn fat. Right here, let's see here, I'm going to highlight that. Right here is the intercostals, and that just means that it's in between the rib. So you have those 13 ribs total, but between those, you're aiming to identify the location to be able to evaluate what that ribeye area is and what that back fat depth and what that measurements are, so we can evaluate carcass merit. With the fat depth on the ultrasound machine, it's in the metric system, and we can collect that in centimeters and millimeters, and then also the ribeye depth that I'll show you could be in centimeters or millimeters, and we use with the ribeye area centimeters squared. Of course, with the conversion, this can be compared and changed and moved to inches or square inches if we so prefer, and at least that's how my head works, but we collect the data, of course, in our metric system. I'm going to show you some opportunities, because if we were to look at then of how we are going to understand and collect carcass data, is that we do have information that we can be able to look at and be able to use. This is one of the machines on the right that's called the Aloka 550 that we primarily use at North Dakota State University. And in fact, if you were to look at other individuals, this would be the most common technology that would be available for ultrasound certifiers and technicians to use. Now, there's also other information that's out there, and in fact, the top left and the bottom left images are from an Exago, E-X-A-G-O machine that I think even provides a neater and clearer image. So on the left, there is the top picture. They drew around that ribeye area. And so, in fact, you're able to go around that ribeye and be able to, again, gather that information of what the expected ribeye area is in a square centimeters that can be converted back to square inches. The bottom picture has a linear line that's from the top of the ribeye to the bottom of the ribeye. If we collect that, that is the ribeye depth. And with that ribeye depth, that can also be used. And in fact, with the correlation to estimated breeding values and working with lamb plan, out of Australia as well. Those can be used to get those EBVs, and for that one, they use ribeye depth. So you see on the right side, the main large portion of the image. We also show how you can draw that ribeye area and then the ribeye depth as well. I've got another example here with that Aloka machine. One of the things that I'd like to show you right here is, in fact, these are both looking at the distance. And so the distance from, let's see here, the top to the bottom on this top left one is 3.2 centimeters. And in fact, that's the same as this bottom image of 3.2 centimeters of the distance from there. I will tell you that with these two images, though, those are lambs that, again, with the image, you don't particularly have the carcass or the live weight, but you would want to record that to identify some information at a later point. In fact, one other thing that we've got here as we look at the data is that the one on the top is 0.5 centimeters from the top of there to the from the hide to the muscle. And so that's our subcutaneous fat that we're being able to evaluate. We record that, and that the 0.5 centimeters is approximately 0.2 inches, and so 2/10 of an inch. And in fact, our one that we've got over here with our image of the eye, you can see that we're collecting the ribeye depth first, and then we would move that and then look at where we are at on back fat thickness. This one's back fat thickness would be pretty close to approximately 0.3 inches of back fat. But the other thing is, I said that the top one was 0.5 inches. The bottom one is 1.1. So that's closer and over 4/10 of back fat. And so if you look at it really closely, again, they're not particularly to scale, but from the top, the ultrasound machine will show a different color when it's evaluating a different density of products. So we at the top, first off, see the area of the hide, and then we see the fat depth, and then we see the loin eye or the rib eye, and then right here is those intercostals of in between, or even close to the rib if you're not careful. And so you can be able to use that as a marker to be able to evaluate where you want to be to collect that information and collect that data. Now, that data can then be sent and utilized through the National Sheep Improvement Program. For tonight's function and event, we're primarily emphasizing carcass traits, of which case one of those will be loin muscle depth, the other 12th rib back fat depth. And so with those are can be used as part of the Carcass Plus Index. At the end of this presentation, I'll show you an example of some of the information and some of the data when we can make our decisions based on the EBVs, or estimated breeding values, within our operation. In fact, with those EBVs, you get to use several different things to help you get to that data. The first thing is that we're going to identify an individual trait. In this case, we're going to evaluate ribeye depth. And so we would evaluate ribeye depth. Both of those that you looked at were 3.2 centimeters. Now, with the contemporary groups, primarily that could be able to say, you know what, I have these 20 rams, and these 20 are what I'm going to be able to evaluate against, what we're going to look for and try to improve on. And so since those were born in a similar time, they can be compared as well. Pedigree is also important, because of those 20 lambs, there's a possibility that 10 of those rams are sired by one, or maybe it's even 12. We'll say that there's 12 of those 20 that are sired by your ram 1403. And then there's 8 of those rams that are sired by your ram 1306. Now, 1403 and 1306 might not mean much to you, but if you have that information, then we can send that in. We can be able to get that information, that data, and be able to say that chances are lambs that come from 1306 have more muscle and have an increase in terms of ribeye depth than Ram 1403. And we can make our decisions based on that. Now, there may be advantages for the growth of either of the rams. There may be advantage on number born alive or maternal traits or even wool emphasis. But as we look at those in the pedigree, that provides us with a little bit more information. The best way to get an increase in the accuracy is through genetic linking. And what I can best describe that as is that if the ram works really, really good for you, another way to prove that that one's even better is to let your neighbor borrow it, or sell it even better. Sell it to your neighbor because you know that that ram is awesome. And it could do good work for that person too, because now you have the data and you have that accuracy. If that producer has 4 other rams and you put yours in there with it as well, and he does a better job than his 4, then that's proof that of those lambs that would be in a similar contemporary group, that those genetic links, since he worked on your ewes and he worked on your neighbor's ewes, those would be ones that help to provide accuracy for that. The next slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the heritability of the traits, because they're a little bit different, but we'll focus on that here in just a little bit, because we're gathering that heritability to gather our estimated breeding values and hopefully derive some genetic progress for our operation. I said we were going to touch on heritability, and in fact, this is intriguing to me as well. I want to draw your attention to the bottom side of that graph, where carcass weight is at 40%, and then weight of the trim cuts, or how much retail yield that we have, is at 45%. The exciting thing about carcass traits is that we can be able to have a greater impact at a quick level, okay? And so we can have a greater impact as well on those animals. And in fact, the more reproductive traits are going to be lower, and the growth in between of the 60, 120 day, and in fact, 240 day traits of growth, again, a little bit smaller than at least the carcass, and on a generalities, the reproductive traits even smaller than that. I put together a quick comparison here between lamb A and lamb B. The difference is that both lamb A and lamb B were sired by the sire D. Now, of course, they come from different females, and in fact, one of them has a weaning weight of 60 pounds, and the other one has a weaning weight of 85 pounds. But if we were to look back on some of them, if the heritability is 20 or 0.2, then 20% of that variation would be due to the genetics. Okay, and so as you are well aware, if you think about it in your family, all right, and I know it's luckily being me, all right, you can look to your brother or your sister to your right if they're joining you, all right, look to the brother or sister to your right. You'll share some traits, all right, but luckily for you, you don't look like them, right? Anyway, but you have the advantage. So, of course, there's some traits that are going to be the same based on the father and the mother, but it's also some of the genetic heritability combined with the environment that makes a difference. Now, if we make improvements or make selections on that, can we get to more in progress? And in fact, the data from 2007 to 2014 for Australia shows that they increased the post-weaning weight of those animals from 8 kilograms to over 11. To bring that back into pounds, that's about 7 pounds of post-weaning weight that you have an advantage. They had an increase in lean meat yield, an increase in carcass eye area, and they made them trimmer. So they made them faster growing, they made them more muscular, and they made them trimmer. The difference is some of these traits are antagonistic, meaning if one goes up, the other goes down. Now, it doesn't have to be like that, but a lot of the times these traits are much like a teeter-totter. And if we put emphasis on a couple of those traits, we can expect them to be a little bit different on the backside. If we push for lean meat yield and increase in carcass eye muscle, as you can see in the bottom middle graph, we decrease the amount of intramuscular fat, or the amount of marbling that were in those ribeye or loin-eye areas. Additionally, we had an increase in the amount of shear force, which means that those particular meat from those animals were tougher than preferred. So in terms of genetic progress, in 2005 to 2016, this has weaning weight and post-weaning weight for the Suffolk breed. And with those in the Suffolk breed, you can see that we've had an increase over that decade. And with the Carcass merit, the blue line is eye muscle depth. The red line is back fat. And so we are getting more muscular sheep with decreasing the amount of fat. I've got a couple quick glory stories to talk about here on progress that we've accomplished in the past decade. The NSIP, National Sheep Improvement Program, polypay breeders have identified that they can wean approximately 13 pounds more per ewe with putting emphasis on what they want to select for. And in fact, on the polypays, okay, that's what we want to do, right? We want to have more lambs. Now, are we worried about ribeye depth? Are we even worried about growth? If we choose polypay, hopefully it's to increase the amount of lambs that we have. But then, since we have an increase in the number, hopefully we can have an increase in the weight too. The Suffolk breed in the past decade has increased 6 pounds of the 120-day weight. And while they've done that, the loin-eye muscle has went up. And as I showed you, the fat is lowered. Targies made some impact on the number of lambs born by approximately 7%. And Katahdins have made progress in weaning weights. And in fact, with the weaning rate or the number of lambs weaned. In fact, they're also pushing to gather some information on internal parasites or fecal egg counts. Now, as we shift within our industry from that estimated breeding values, it's important to realize that a lot of lambs are finished in a lot of different places, but the largest amount of feeding in the U.S. is certainly in two particular counties in Colorado, with being Larimer and Weld counties. In the Fort Collins and Greeley areas is where a lot of those lambs are raised. In fact, the top one shows a picture of some of those larger outfits that being able to feed lambs. And the bottom pictures here in North Dakota. We have a covered shed of where we could be able to feed some lambs as well, because as crazy as this is in Wyoming, sometimes it gets even wilder here relative to a winter in Fargo, North Dakota. Now, an important part of my ideas and why I appreciate Dawn and the University of Wyoming Extension inviting me to help provide this information is that I think it's great to have more information. And so with the North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota Gate to Rail program, we gathered these 356 head of lambs to collect information about what producers were interested in doing and what they were trying to accomplish within their operations. We collected then the Carcass grading and value that we'll touch on here just a little bit. And of those 356, we had an expected fat thickness of 0.32 inches. And so a little bit over 3/10. We had a live weight of 137 pounds and the dressing percentage of approximately 50 to 51%. The ribeye was only 2.36, and so in fact, that's certainly something that I think that we can get a lot better at. So of those lambs, they certainly did look nice, but I think that we can be able to make those a little bit more trimmer, and I think that we can make them a little bit more muscular as we move through on terms of selection with the data. I gave you this quick update as well, and this is actually from this past week of yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s. The yield grade 1s are the trimmer lambs. USDA yield grade takes the back fat or the 12th rib back fat multiplied by 10 and add 0.4. So if we have a lamb with 22 hundredths of back fat, 0.22, little less than a quarter of an inch, then we would move that decimal from 0.22 to 2.2 and then add 0.4 to get to a USDA yield grade of 2.6. So the most common location there is in yield grade 3. In fact, the more challenges come on those that get to yield grade 4 and yield grade 5 because they're certainly a little heavier in terms of their condition as well. Also, we are now approaching approximately 10% of the lambs that go USDA prime. The differences in value is different than the beef cattle industry is that there's not an extra bonus for those lambs that make it into prime in comparison to choice. I have a picture there as well on spool versus break joints, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The difference is that we want to identify what is lamb. And according to one FSIS, or Food Safety Inspection Service Directive, they've identified that a lamb is the non-eruption of the permanent teeth, the break joint at the epiphyseal plate that I'll show you at in the next slide, or under 14 months of age. In fact, this is actually from the same carcass, but if you can see on the left, that is a break joint. It looks a little bit more mountainous, and that's at the epiphyseal plate here of where the number 1 is coming together. And if it gets older, that location changes from cartilage to bone and becomes a spool joint, which then would be considered a mutton. Also, in terms of quality grading that we won't focus on primarily too much today, as I said, we can identify those that are young, and so they have to have that break joint. But then we can look at the carcass conformation at the bottom side, and those that are more muscular and kind of shorter and more compact potentially can make it into the USDA prime grade in comparison to USDA choice in the middle. And then if they're really light muscled, or if there is an inadequate amount of external back fat, those lambs could potentially be graded as USDA good. The difference is that they don't grade those USDA good. They'll just let them go and merchandise them as ungraded lamb. So again, a subpar category that's just too light muscled or doesn't have enough fat thickness in order to assure quality for our consumers. So most lamb that would be merchandised would, if it was to be graded, which is a voluntary portion of our industry, is that it would be USDA choice or better. Also, the last thing that we would look at is the flank streaking. And in fact, for us to make it into the choice grade, a lot of that would be looked at of the slight, small, or even on the low end of modest. Those should be able to get us in, again, to the choice category. If we can move up to into the modest and even into the moderate, then the flank streaking helps to move it into USDA prime. It's kind of a complicated system of gathering that all together on maturity, carcass conformation, and flank streaking. But at least you've got an idea of the basics, and we can worry about that as you study that on your own. Let's move to cutability and the evaluations of trimness and muscle. I put on this big picture there 2 small streaks of blue at the midline, or about the 50th percentile of the length of the ribeye here at the 12th rib. This lamb in particular is pretty trim. And in fact, this one would be at approximately 0.2 inches of back fat. But you can at least identify where we're at. Also, I showed on the bottom right a 12th rib ribeye with the lamb grid over top of it. The small square in the middle is 2 square inches. Outside of that, you would count the dots that are also over top of the ribeye area, and then divide that by 2, and then add it to the 2. Now, I don't want to get it too tricky, but that one's approximately a 2.8 square inch ribeye. The one on the left that's still in color that's smaller is actually a little larger, and in fact, that one would potentially be even closer to maybe 3 square inches. But again, that one's farther back on the carcass because we have the tenderloin, and that is a loin chop, not exactly the same orientation of the muscles that you would expect from the other ones. Now, on the body wall measurements, I have here on the lambs on 3 and 4 within this lineup. I show on the left side where we would evaluate the body wall from those animals. Okay, and so of that body wall, that's about 5 inches, 4.5 to 5 inches from the midline of the carcass of the spinal cord of where we would evaluate that. The lamb on the right is substantially trimmer over the body wall than the lamb number 4, then lamb number 3. Those lambs, as they continue to grow and continue to mature, if you think about your lambs as you're showing them at the county fair, remember, you will handle them on the top, and then you'll handle them over the forerib, okay, or the rib, to see how fat or how much chubby those lambs are. And so that's an indication, is that body wall and how those animals are getting a little bit farther. And so that gives us a guesstimation of how trim or how muscular those are. We had some lambs that have went through several different functions and events here at North Dakota State University. In fact, here's one of my favorite ones at 17,304. His live weight is 131 pounds. As I told you, the average for lambs, at least within our area, and this is pretty close in terms of what our industry is that 130 pounds to 140 pounds is about where our average is. This is a Dorset wether with a similar or pretty average amount of back fat, also a relatively average amount of muscularity. But the fun thing is, as I told you, of collecting this information and collecting this data is applying it. And so if we get this, we can have the live weight of 131, dressing percentage of 55%, okay, hot carcass weight of 72, and then the back 12th rib back fat thickness is 0.32 on this guy. So again, close to our industry average. Our ribeye area was 2.4. That's about exactly what our average was for our industry. And it would be a choice quality grade. And so relative to the amount of lambs that came through, at least in our previous one, here's one that's similar relative to the amount of fat and the amount of muscle that we would try to accomplish. Now, here's one that's a little bit more fun. If we're hanging out as part of Wyoming Extension and getting our lambs ready for the 4-H and the county fair, or even the state fair, here's a lamb that does some extremely good things in carcass merit. In fact, this was a lamb that won the Sioux Empire Farm Show in January. He weighed 156 pounds, as we've had him here at North Dakota State University, but he's way trimmer, he's way more muscular, and here's one that I certainly really like. The more exciting thing about it is that we can see that he's somewhat trim and somewhat muscular, but with the bonus is that now we can be able to evaluate him and look at where he is relative to trimness and muscle. If we look at that picture on the right with the 12th rib interface, here's one that has 0.11, 0.11 inches of back fat. It has a 4.4 ribeye area. And even if we look at the carcass over on the left-hand side, here's one that we can read. It is certainly trimmer, certainly more muscular than the Dorset wether that I also additionally showed you. I want to do just one quick comparison. In fact, this isn't meant to be very data-driven, but the longissimus dorsi muscle, or that ribeye area that we've been looking at in comparison to the U.S., Australia, and New Zealand. Of lamb loins that are available at retail, the U.S. Ribeye area is approximately 3.0. I showed you some pictures there initially of ones that were about 3.0. Australia is a little smaller at 2.6, and New Zealand at 2.25. Now, some of those lambs we take to heavier weights than the 137 pounds, and that'll help us get there. But again, I showed you that those with a more maternal or even a crossbred focus aren't nearly as big as we would prefer and would go to different marketing chains. The other thing that I have evaluated on here is the second area that is circled, and that's just showing that in comparison in fat thickness, that the Australian lambs, even though smaller, are trimmer than both of the American and New Zealand products. Okay, we'll finish up here and focusing and look at lamb instrument grading. And so I think that it's so important here, and then we'll apply this within our industry, is that this is our next step of information. Lamb instrument grading, or cameras, will take a picture of the rear view, as you see on the top right picture, and then the side view on the bottom right picture, and collects those information those data points on what we would expect to identify and find. If we're going to say that we have that information that's available to us, then we can be able to provide that information to producers. Apologize, I should have blown this up a little bit, but hopefully you can identify that on the individual carcass data that's available to producers if and when we get through this and get it implemented into our system. So augmented USDA grading has been approved for use at the Superior Farms plant in Dixon, California. This information includes the harvest date, the radio frequency identification, lot number, serial number, hot carcass weight, yield grade, the cold weight of the carcass, and in fact, then as we switch to the right side, it has the quality grade that is available, and then ovine carcass cutability, or OCC. And in fact, what's even more exciting is that, of course, it's identifying the yield grade and expected quality grade, but then it's predicting how much trimmed product we would have as it goes through the fabrication line for breast, rack, square cut shoulder, leg, loin, neck, and trotters, or the bottom side of the bones of the legs. So this information helps us because those that, again, are closer to yield grade 1 in comparison to yield grade 5 on the bottom right as we orientate you, has a greater amount of lean meat yield for those operations. So the blue is the French rack, red is the shoulder, green is the loin, and purple is the leg. We would expect the greatest amount of our carcass cuts to come from the leg, followed by the shoulder. But as we move forward or move from trimmer to fatter lambs, we're going to have less product because some of it's going to get cut out. And in fact, if we look at these, it becomes a challenge of also making sure that we get those rib chops or loin chops at 1/4 of an inch or an 1/8 inch of back fat. But the difference is that we have seam fat challenges as well. And if we look in here, we can see that there's too much seam fat or intermuscular fat that's in between those, or this blade chop right here that we're going to be selling to our consumers. And so we want to, again, make a high quality product for our individuals and operations. Now, luckily for you, there's not going to be a giant quiz, but maybe you'll be able to evaluate different topics of our industry, but I don't want you to particularly memorize this. But this is our percent boneless closely trimmed retail cuts. With this is information that can be used to identify how much, identify where we're at on the industry for our evaluation of cutability. And so it uses hot carcass weight, back fat, body wall, and ribeye area for us to look at. So here's maybe as important as slide as any of them that we've got. And in fact, this one is just from this past Friday of evaluating the prices per pound for each of those primal and subprimal cuts of a lamb carcass. So in our 4-H programs, and as we think about adding value to our information, this is why we want lambs with a big rack, okay, or that right area directly behind its shoulders, okay. Then we have that opportunity right here at the rack to find ones with more muscle, like that blue-hided sheep that we showed, okay. Loin next, and there's not going to be very much difference in the foreshank in terms of weight, and then leg and shoulder relative to important cuts. But again, down that top line are more expensive and more valuable cuts for our industry, and that's why we want more muscular lambs, because right now, on a carcass basis system, they're worth $3 and nearly 80 cents per pound. So if you bring that, again, back to a live weight, then that's, or a live price, then that's approximately 100 or it's at worth $3.80, okay? And we know that lambs right now on a live weight basis are approximately $1.50, at least in our area. That carcass value is $265. I just throw this in here as well to look at our retail cuts. And in different locations of America, we have different preferences on cuts. The Northeast is the most popular region that consumes lamb. The Southeast also is next, followed by California. And the leg, shoulder, and as you see, are the most common. The loin is the most common in the West, and we have approximately a U.S. per capita consumption. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't done a real good job of keeping it interactive, but please raise your hand if you eat more than 1 pound of lamb per person per year. You're like, yeah, that's right. I do my job. Okay. So now all we got to do is get all the other 4-Hers and parents and families, all right, to continue to consume lamb. But that's the approximation that across America, we consume approximately 1.1 pounds of lamb per person. So I've got just a couple ones to see how we can improve this and how we can gather that information, because if we have the estimated breeding values, or if we have that carcass information like I showed you, then we can be able to identify what we want to do. And so if we're understanding our carcass data, we can be able to then look at a potential terminal sire cross on white-faced commercial ewes for the production of feeder lambs. Here's the different EBVs that we can be able to evaluate. From going down on the left-hand column, lambing rate, weaning rate, average weaning weight, average loin eye area, average back fat thickness, okay? And then ewe fleece weight, fiber diameter, and parasite resistance. So on this, when we are deciding which ram we should look at, we are first off, when you identify the priority, is that you want average weaning weight as the most important thing, followed by loin eye area, and then followed by back fat thickness. And so then you can identify what percentile or what levels of estimated breeding values that you would want to incorporate within your operation. And then hopefully if you go to a progressive person's operation, you can be able to use that information and use that data to help you evaluate which rams or which ewes, if you have that information, can work best for you. So again, in terms of even our ultrasound information, what you would potentially have would be back fat and ribeye area. Of course, if we were to take those to harvest, and if we particularly gather the information on a grid marketing basis, which means that we're not paid for them just on the live value, but we're paid for them on the carcass weight value, we could be able to then identify what the hot carcass weight is, also what the USDA yield grade, the USDA quality grade, and the percent boneless closely trimmed retail cuts are for our operation. Then we can be able to see how we can be able to gather that information. Now, with this particular example, we've said that we want to increase weaning weight and then increase loin eye area. And in fact, if we were to go to an operation, we may get this amount of information or data. Okay, so now we've got too much. Let's think of it now, since you guys are stockmen. As we initially got expected progeny differences, and at least when I was growing up, that was the bull sale catalog came out with a whole bunch of numbers. And then that at some point, particularly producers, and maybe your family as well, said, well, I'm just going to go out and pick the Angus bull I like. But now we're realizing that we can be able to identify where our targets are and be able to make those improvements. With this particular example, and in fact, this is it happens to be a polypay, but it doesn't particularly matter, is that the birth weight is above 0, above the average, okay? And you don't know particularly the average on here, but there's the maternal weaning weight, okay? So how much of the weaning weight did that ewe produce? And in fact, the weaning weight EBV of that individual, okay, and the post-weaning weight. Also, as we go back, yearling weight, and then weaning fecal egg count, post-weaning fecal egg count. Fecal egg count is a guesstimation relative to the potential resistance or susceptibility of parasites for those animals. In fact, big picture, as I look at it from a genetic standpoint, I thought that was the wild and craziest thing, that we could be able to collect data and information to have an idea which ones would be more susceptible to parasites in the same environment. And so I think it's great information. But hey, we're not focusing even on number born alive on this one. We're focusing on post-weaning weight, okay, or weaning weight. And let's see here. We're aiming for weaning weight. We are aiming for post-weaning weight in this particular scenario. And then as we get back down here, we had number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, and then the maternal index. The challenges with this particular example then is that we were looking at, again, polypay sheep, and the post-weaning muscle and the post-weaning fat didn't have a particular value. Now, let me tell you, within this particular example is that they didn't collect the ultrasound data. And so if we think about it, we know which ones could potentially be in that group faster growing, but without collecting the data along our supply chain, it makes it a little bit tougher. And so if we don't collect our ultrasound information or get the carcass data and cutouts from the processing plant, we don't really know if we're going to make any improvements or move forward in our progress. Let me tell you that to figure this out at the end, to close things up, is that you can manage what you can measure. And hopefully I inspired you, at least from looking at breeds initially, and then looking at the growth rates of those animals, because we know that larger framed animals can grow more and go to larger weights. And then if we can collect that ultrasound information or go to a seed stock producer that provides that information, potentially on carcass merit, or ultrasound the lambs that you have of your ewes that you may be selecting, and make it that a part of your selection criteria if that's something that you want to work on. Then I said that we'll have carcass data that you can have even on the contemporary groups of those weather lambs that you would merchandise, and or of the rams that we'd have, but also from those weathers of getting that carcass data, or at least from our market lambs if we were to get that information. And then combining that together, because we have our estimated breeding values if we were to so look and gather that information. Now, if we can create a benchmark and say, you know what, we want to produce fast-growing, trim, and muscular lambs. If we can say that we want to increase ribeye, decrease trimness, increase growth, and increase the percent of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, the data would say we can do it. The difference is making that selection. Now, after 45 minutes of a presentation here, we also need to consider is this something that we want to do? This is going to take some time, it's going to take some effort, and it's most importantly probably going to take some paperwork and some decision making. So if you identify our target here of where we want to be, and in fact that can be different within any different particular person, but then you can identify what your target is and be able to use the ultrasound carcass data or the carcass data in general to put an impact on our end product cutability, our end product quality, and hopefully we're doing everything that we can in terms of safe and a wholesome product for our American lamb producers, because it's exciting within our industry. I believe that we have a tremendous opportunity here in the production of American lamb. You can see some of the different cuts that I've gotten to evaluate, and again, some of them had to sacrifice for the sake of science, but somebody has to accomplish that. But again, we've had a great emphasis in terms of carcass merit and carcass evaluation, and we can do better. Particularly what I challenge you on is to learn about those carcass traits and those carcass merit that can help provide more beneficial for your market lambs in our 4-H and FFA programs and through the University of Wyoming extension. Evaluate those that have a little bit more muscularity to them, that may keep it trim enough. Now, we don't want them too trim, and if we get those lambs at 115 pounds and less than 2/10 of back fat, it's trimmer than we need, because then we're not going to get the dressing percentage. Well, those lambs would also be more challenged in terms of shrink or lose a little bit more weight in the carcass process, and we'd like a little bit of lamb of the fat tissue there, because that's what provides our flavor. The difference is as you saw in some of those with some seam fat, is that then we get some extra. And if we get too much extra, then it becomes a little bit more overwhelming relative to the intensity of the flavor profile, particular of how we're producing it. So it's certainly a balance. I truthfully believe that we can keep those lambs at approximately 1500ths to 2500ths, maybe even 3/10 at the most is plenty. Probably 15 to 3/10, and then maybe that's again staying in the primarily the yield grade 2 portion is where you're going to get your bonus. And if you were selling on a grid-based system, those that are going to get the bonus are the ones that stay in a logical hot carcass weight. 55 to approximately 70, 75 will get you the bonus on weight. Yield grade will get you the bonus on yield grade 2s. You won't get an advantage for being yield grade 1 because, as I said, it's just too trim. Yield grade 3 is home base, and when we change to a value-based marketing system, yield grade 4s and yield grade 5s are going to continue to take discounts within our industry. And the last thing there is, again, I talked about carcass weight. I talked about the fat and cutability. But if we can increase the amount of muscularity, and that's simple, if we can be able to provide a selection-based criteria on those that provide more muscle, we can have larger loin chops and larger ribeyes in those lambs. Quality grade, as I said, is something that we don't have as much control of, but if we aim for ones that have some muscularity, there's a potential for those to increase. And in fact, the value differentiation, as I said, if we get into USDA low choice, isn't that different once we get to choice and prime. So I think that we can be able to implement those information. And I think that as you think about it within your 4-H and FFA programs, think about how you can just get better. And so if we think about with the beginning in mind, you saw Spot earlier. And if we can make them like Spot with trimness and muscle and at a carcass weight that works, then we're being able to provide that carcass data. We're able to utilize that data to make improvements within our industry. Appreciate your time. I know hopefully Dawn can be a colleague in here in between and help us on the questions and formulating that back to me if there is some. Thank you very much. I look forward to any initial dialogue, team, and I'm sure there's others that weren't able to make it tonight that hopefully enjoy the recording for us as well. Thanks. Thank you, Dawn.
Perfect, Travis. I think there are some questions. There's a few in the chat box, but before I go to those, you guys that are on, do you want to unmute yourself? And do you have questions you'd like to ask Travis?
Yes, thanks, Mom. Travis, how do you tell acorn fat from a distance?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. That's a tricky question. Nice work. So that acorn fat was a picture of a beef ribeye. Yes. And so if we go back, if you evaluate the beef ribeye, it can be seen, but when we do that ultrasound on a lamb, we won't find it. Okay.
Okay.
Because here's the lamb shape, and there's not a particular indentation right there 3/4 of the way. If I'm correct on the cattle one, let's see here.
It was.
Yeah, I'm close.
Yes.
Okay, and so I apologize. I don't particularly have a beef image, but the image that I do have, I hope that you can see it there. There will be that little indentation of white. And so you would be able to see that on a beef cattle image, or those that get a good image on beef cattle, you would see it. But you won't see it on lambs. That's not how the shape of it's designed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Anybody else have questions for Travis? All right, Travis, there's a couple more. Maybe somebody will mute, but one of the questions was, if you were going to collect the data on the rams, at what age do those lambs have to be? Do they have to have market-ready lambs, or they can take those when they're weaning?
Yeah, great question as well. For the most part, you're going to want to collect that information at a market weight. And so that's exactly right as you would think about that. I would presume that between, from particularly for a blackface type sheep, that between 130 pounds and 150 pounds would be the approximate time that you would want to make that evaluation. In fact, if you had lambs that were within 130 and 150, and I had 12 Suffolk rams that I was collecting data on, you could then be able to use that information, pick out your 6 that are above average, and still send the other 6 to the auction barn or to the market, and hopefully not discounted largely. In fact, I'm also got some research project looking at rams and value, and then they're very similar in terms of weathers on eating satisfaction. But correct, within a market weight, I will tell you that if you have, we're aiming on it from a carcass standpoint with white-faced sheep, like the Targhee or other different breeds, is that they will obviously mature at a later point and a later value. And so some of those say that on a white-faced type sheep or a maternal sheep, that you might even go a little higher to 160 or 180. They're just so much older and so much later maturing. But it makes sense. Big picture, Dawn, is that get them scanned when they're at market weight, because that's what we're wondering.
Perfect. Okay. There's one more question here that says, you kind of covered as far as with the back fat between the 0.15 to 0.3 is like a goal. So what is your ideal goal for a ribeye area? And what is that in market? If you could say what the ideal market weight is right now, I know it's a big span, but what would be your a goal?
Okay. So a couple of different things. I'll evaluate back fat there. And so even to get into yield grade 2, or at the bottom side of 2 would be 0.16, because I said you add or multiply it by 10 to get to add 0.4. So I should say that 1600ths is the bottom end relative to getting that bonus. And at the highest is 3500ths, because that gets us to a 3.9. I'm not convinced that that's exactly, but 16 to 25 is where we prefer. Right now on fat, again, people are keeping them a little bit heavier and trying to fill in the loin edge type thing and our hip loin, but that's okay. We're doing good. From a ribeye standpoint, a show lamb should be over 3 square inches. There should particularly be no reason that you can't get over 3 to 3.5 square inches on a 140-pound lamb. Should be accomplishable. The other thing is that if I said that 3.0 square inches on a 130-pound sheep, for every 10 pounds of live weight, you get approximate 1/10 of an inch of ribeye area for each of those. So if that lamb is at 130 and it has a 3.0, at 140 it would have an approximate 3.1, and at 150 it'd have an approximate 3.2. So it's going to grow somewhat relationship as well. And in terms of carcass weight, now there's a couple different things, all right? Is that those that are under or at approximately 60 to 80 pounds live. Now, again, that's not even a market lamb to us, but some of those at 60 to 80 pounds live are outrageous in terms of pricing, particularly in the spring and near Easter. Those could potentially be over $2 a pound. In Pennsylvania, they were over $3 a pound, but that's a different market that goes to ethnic portion. Right now, what holds the most flexibility is carcass weights at 60 to 75 pounds. So a live weight of 120 to 150 gets you into that area of a bonus. There's no reason particular to have lambs less than 120. There's not a large reason to have lambs over 150 if you're aiming to provide them the most flexibility. I will tell you on that particular question is that our processors and packers do a tremendous job of taking in all the randomness that we have, from the short little baby doll South down to the giant 500-pound Suffolk sheeps, okay? And so they do so many things, and they merchandise them at different places. There's room for small ones. There's room for big ones, but it provides them enough flexibility if we can aim for right there at 70 pounds of live weight, 135 to 140 pounds, or excuse me, 70 carcass weight, 135 to 140 pounds is the most ideal.
Perfect. Thank you. The other question they said they had figured out. So just one more call. Anybody else? Do you have questions for Travis?
Yeah, so like if they gain 6 pounds over 120 days, does that mean that they're also burning fat, or is that just the average weight, like when you're judging them if they have the information?
Okay, just help me out here. If they gain 6 pounds,
In 120 days, are they also burning the fat, or is that just the average that they all get?
so they should gain more. Okay. So are you talking of the previous graph at 120 pounds? They had an increase, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great question. And so that's from our previous data that in that 120 days, we have was, are they actually gaining muscle or are they gaining fat? Okay, and so we can use this data. And so that's a great question, is that in comparison on this, we had an increase in the amount of lean meat yield, and that's in centimeters depth in millimeters. Okay, so in millimeters, but we have an increase in the depth of the ribeye or loin. With this one, we actually trended, of course, down. So the data on this one, on the Australian portion, would say that the weight that they were putting on was muscle. Absolutely. Great question, and you had to make me push into the information and data, so way to challenge me.
Good job, guys. Any other questions for Travis? All right. Well, I will tell you, I think there's just some really cool points that he covered. I think if whether you're raising commercial sheep or whether you're just raising a market lamb for your 4-H project, I think a lot of this is relevant across the board to each and every one of them. I will tell you one of the things I think that is really interesting is on the Carcass slide on the slide that Travis shared, the difference in price of those lambs. I think it's really an interesting concept to think that. And so if you're showing show lambs in the 4-H world, is that really makes sense on a microphone or as a judge is evaluating, or if you're raising those commercial sheep, or those are things that you're probably not. This is the slide I was alluding to. So I think those are really good concepts that you guys can take and probably apply to either facet of whether you're just raising a small one or you're raising commercial sheep. So with that, before you guys get off, is if you could put in the chat box is helpful, is that